Hello, my name is Paul Radanovich, and my project is on the senses and whether or not they are trustworthy. I took a college course back at Franciscan University, and one of the professors tried to explain that, all of our sources of information, they boil down to three things. They boil down to our senses, our memory, and other people's testimony. And he then went on to explain that, in order to prove that the senses were sometimes reliable, you had to use your senses. And the same applied to the memory. In order to prove that your memory was sometimes reliable, you had to use it. And then other people's testimony, if the memory and the senses are circular arguments, then other people's testimony don't work because they depend on the memory and the senses. I remember this bothered me quite a bit, so I thought about it for years, and it kind of led me to this point. So what I want to do is examine reasons why we might find the senses to be untrustworthy. And the reason why I'm going to focus on the senses is because the memory is just stored sensory images. So we can just boil down this issue to just the senses. So the first philosophical work we're going to look at is by René Descartes. It is Meditations on First Philosophy. I just want to apologize if I'm a little quiet. I am trying to be mindful of other people in my building. So, anyway, Descartes is known as the father of modern philosophy. His work was pivotal in starting the modern movement. So he has some reasons to suggest that the senses are not trustworthy, and therefore we shouldn't listen to them. He says, all that up to the present time I have accepted as most true and certain I have learned either from the senses or through the senses. But it is sometimes proved to me that these senses are deceptive, and it is wiser not to trust entirely to anything by which we have once been deceived. So, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice kind of thing. So that begs the question, well, how do the senses deceive us? There are many examples we could give of somebody describing the senses deceiving us. We could say, people think they saw or heard something that they didn't. We could say that people experience mirages and illusions. People hallucinate. People often get tricked by the sleight of hand of magicians and illusionists. And people could even mistake an image for the real thing. Think of Plato's allegory of the cave, right? The shadows were being mistaken as the real thing, even though they were just images of the real thing. And we also have photorealistic art. There are examples where people paint on the street, and from a certain angle it looks like something crazy is happening, and then it's real. And then you just move your angle slightly, and then you realize, it was painted a certain way. So you have photorealistic art. We have virtual reality, which somebody could potentially, eventually, mistake as real life. And then Descartes himself provides an example. He says, I find, for example, two completely diverse ideas of the sun in my mind. The one derives its origin from the senses and should be placed in the category of adventitious ideas. According to this idea, the sun seems to be extremely small, but the other is derived from astronomical reasonings, i.e., is elicited from certain notions that are innate in me, or else it is formed by me in some other manner. In accordance with it, the sun appears to be several times greater than the earth. These two ideas cannot indeed both resemble the same sun, and reason makes me believe that the one which seems to have originated directly from the sun itself is the one which is most dissimilar to it. So he explains that the senses are seemingly deceiving us when something is far away, and it looks small. He also provides an argument against the senses from dreams. He says that when we're dreaming, we believe we're sensing. We are not using our bodily organs during that time. So it stands to reason that sensing is thinking then. It's an act of thinking and is not an act of the body. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's maybe untrue, except insofar as it maybe doesn't originate outside of ourselves. Sensing does not originate, or the objects by which we sense do not originate outside of ourselves in this view. But it would seem that the senses would tell us that there are objects outside of ourselves. There is a non-self to be found. The phone that I'm looking at to record this certainly isn't me, from what the senses tell me. So maybe there's an issue with the trustworthiness of the senses if we go that route. Additionally, he goes on to say that we can, just thinking about what we can doubt, we could conceive of an evil demon orchestrating everything to seem like it's real when it's really not, right? Like an evil demon god kind of thing. So that's another way that he argues against the senses, that we can conceive them to be feeding us lies. So anyway, that's Descartes. The next work we're going to look at comes from Plato. It's his Theaetetus. It's Socrates' dialogue with Theaetetus. And I'm not going to take Socrates' arguments in this work to argue against the trustworthiness of the senses, because mainly what he's doing here is arguing against the idea that sense perception is knowledge itself. And he gives many arguments for why that can't be the case. Perception isn't knowledge. They aren't synonymous. But one of the ideas that is brought up in this work is Pythagorean theory, that things are just as they appear to particular human beings, and they don't exist outside of our perception. So from here he gives this cold wind argument where the wind might feel cold to me but warm to you, and that's a contradiction. We can't say that the wind is cold in itself or warm in itself. Therefore, he has this idea that everything is purely relational to us, and there are no properties that exist in themselves, only properties that exist relationally to me. So the wind is cold to me, and the wind is cold to you, and that's not a contradiction. So as long as we keep that condition. So that was one of the leading prevailing thoughts at the time of knowledge, that knowledge is perception, and this idea was very popular from Pythagoras. Why that's relevant is because if everything is completely relational, then there is no objective exterior reality, in which case my senses aren't telling me the truth, because my senses they're providing me data, but they are seemingly telling us that that these things exist outside of ourselves. Again, so it goes back to that old evil god demon idea that Descartes had. If this is If this is only seeming and not real, what I'm experiencing with my senses, then my senses are lying to me, and they aren't being trustworthy. And I can't know anything then, since all information comes from the senses, which is a problem. And then this kind of plays into a little bit what we read for class with William Gallagher. That would be Gallagher's review on virtual realism, the virtual realist idea of perception. So just like Protagoras, virtual realists, they believe that sensible properties such as color, sound, taste, warmth, odor, these are all relational truths, not objective truths. One of the things that Gallagher states is that they think this because of the dissatisfaction of trying to determine which of the, quote, numberless color perceptions of a certain object was right, all the others being presumably not quite right. And when we speak of the color of a particular object, we are speaking in reference to the conditions by which it is being sensed. So virtual realists, they claim that asking about the true color of the object is like asking about how it would look to someone who wasn't situated in any particular set of circumstances, which is a seemingly impossible task. They say that sensible properties are merely, quote, data which are present in the interaction of object and observer, end quote. Thus, virtual realists are the ones who answer no to the classic philosophical question: if a tree falls in the middle of a forest with no one around, does it make a sound? They do, however, affirm that there are what is called primary properties, such as extension, that objectively exists. So these secondary properties like color, sound, etc., those don't objectively exist, but extension does. So maybe they would disagree with Protagoras there. Again, this still raises issues for us because the senses are not receiving truth, at least insofar as they're not receiving truth with these secondary properties. So whenever you're perceiving, oh, this pillow is blue, you can't believe that the pillow is blue in itself, which means that my sense of sight is receiving falsehood, right? So this is a lot to take in. Where do we start? Well, let's start with Descartes. So looking back at Descartes, when we talk about people thinking they saw or heard something that they didn't, people experiencing mirages or illusions, people getting tricked by sleight of hand with magicians, people mistaking images for the real object, these are all examples of people not understanding correctly what they're perceiving. So the problem isn't perception. The problem is their judgment about the perception, right? So the senses aren't lying to you. You just mistake. You're just mistaking it for being something other than what it is. So whenever you see a mirage and you see in the distance with the moving, waving sand, and you see that the sand's not actually moving like waves in an ocean. It's actually so hot out that heat is bending the light, and at the horizon you are thinking that the ground is moving when it's actually not, but you are witnessing an actual physical phenomenon. That's an example of, again, misunderstanding what we're seeing. The example of people hallucinating, I will get to that in a bit, because then we can talk about the dream, right? Well, when we dream, we're sensing, right? We think we're sensing, but there is a way to tell between dreaming and being awake. Modern philosopher Thomas Hobbes gives great conditions by which we can use to to determine whether or not we're asleep or awake, whether we're dreaming or awake. And one of them, for example, is that when we're awake, we acknowledge the absurdity of our dreams, but when we're dreaming, we don't acknowledge the absurdity of being awake. And another criteria that he uses for determining whether or not we're awake, he says that we don't have a long train of coherent thoughts while we are dreaming, but we do when we're awake. And so then what is going on then? If dreaming is not sensing exterior reality, what is it? Well, it would make sense that dreams are just our stored sensory images being used, with the brain being active, even though we are not conscious. And so that would explain why we dream of memories sometimes. It would also explain why we dream of new events, right? Because in one case it's the memory being used, in another case it's the imagination. But in either case, both are using stored sensory images. And if you were to never sense, you could never dream then, because you would have no stored sensory images. So that's how we would account for sensing while we're dreaming. So let's talk about hallucinations, or another example of senses lying to us would be, I think Socrates even brings this up, maybe not in Theaetetus, but in one of his other works he brings up well Socrates and ill Socrates. And whenever well Socrates is eating a certain food, it might taste sweet and pleasing, and then whenever he's ill Socrates, now it tastes bitter. That same food will taste bitter and will not be pleasing. And so how do we account for that? How do we account? I mean, granted, that also goes along with the Protagorean idea that everything is relational, right? The food isn't sweet in and of itself, because whenever you're eating it sick, it's now bitter. So it kind of goes along with that. How do we account for it? How do we account for hallucinations? How do we account for whenever you get hit in the head hard enough, you see stars? Or you hear ringing in your ears, right? How do we account for this? Well, these things suggest that the senses are physical, unlike what Descartes would say, right? Descartes thinks that sensing is an act of thinking only and not related to the body whatsoever. But if we concede that sensing is a bodily act and that it depends on our bodily sense organs, then whenever these things have a defect, it makes sense that we're not going to receive things properly from the senses, right? So whenever I am sick, it would make sense that food isn't going to taste the same, because my sense of taste is now being affected by my illness, because my illness is bodily and my sense of taste is bodily. Whenever I get hit in the head and I'm seeing stars and hearing ringing, I have a bodily defect going on of being injured in my head. A lot of sensing goes on up here. So that would account for situations where the senses are receiving falsehood, and it would be acknowledging bodily defects. Bodily defects can create situations where the senses aren't working properly, because when they work properly, are they receiving truth? I think we have to admit that they do, because if we didn't, then we couldn't claim to know anything at all. We would create a self-defeating argument of sorts. We would say, well, I can't trust that my senses are reliable at all. But the very reasoning by which I say this, I have abstracted from what I have sensed, right? The principles I have abstracted. Because if all of our information comes from our senses, and we abstract principles and natures and accidental properties from the things that we sense, and therefore reason by the principles that we've abstracted from what we've sensed, then to argue against the source of our information and the source of our principles would be to use the principles to defeat the principles. And therein lies the self-defeating argument. And so, in order to know anything at all, we have to accept that the senses receive truth, that they are trustworthy. Otherwise, you have to forfeit the science of epistemology and any science whatsoever. So if we take that to be a first principle of epistemology, that the senses receive truth, now we can look at the Protagoras' theory. We can look at virtual realism and see how we can account for what they're suggesting. So, insofar as they suggest that there is a relational activity going on, they are correct, of course, because there is the object, there is the subject, right? The one sensing, and there's all that data in between, right? That's fair. But if we have to take it for granted that the senses are receiving truth, then there is an exterior reality outside of my sensation. When Protagoras brings up the cold wind argument, and he says, oh, the wind is cold for you and warm for me, or vice versa, that doesn't change the fact that the wind is transmitting air at a certain temperature to you and to me. And my body's temperature is different than your body's temperature. What I'm wearing is different than what you're wearing. And it could be that the wind feels cold to me and warm to you, but yet, objectively, it's one temperature. It's just that we're two different temperatures, and that's why relationally it affects us differently. Even the terms cold and hot, they're always implying some sort of relation or comparison, right? I can't say something is just hot. I have to say it's hot compared to what? If I say it's hot outside, I'm comparing it maybe to previous days where it was colder, or I'm comparing it from its normal temperatures. But I can't just say it's hot outside in and of itself. So that terminology is implying a comparison already. Yet we are still receiving truth. We're receiving, oh, it's this temperature. And my body reacts that way in comparison to whatever my temperature is. In regard to the problems that the virtual realists have with trying to determine what's the true color of an object, Gallagher later accounts for this kind of problem. He states that we could claim, what some do, that just because science correlates color with light waves or warmth with molecular motion, this does not by any means prove that the secondary qualities do not also exist objectively. Heat may be an objective concomitant of molecular motion, color an objective concomitant of light waves, or they both might be co-equal objective properties discernible from different vantage points. So, yes, circumstances affect how we view things, right? The amount of light in the room is going to determine, and what kind of light, by the way. Is it a yellow light? Is it a blue light? Kind of like this ceiling fan, right? Or this lamp right here. That determines what color I look like. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an objective concoction of light waves happening to make the color that you are sensing right now. Although colors are contingent on the light in this room. That doesn't mean that they aren't objective while those lights exist. So that's an answer to the virtual realists. And that would again account for the fact that the senses are receiving truths, even of these, what the virtual realists call secondary properties. And this would also mean if there is this exterior reality, that whenever the tree would fall in the forest, it would presumably make a sound. Another thing that Gallagher brings up is that if you believe in an absolute consciousness transcending our own, in which all these qualities are perpetually held fast. On this view, one way to sustain naive realism would be espousing absolute idealism. So that was a quote. So naive realism is kind of what I'm advocating here. But also not dismissing the fact that things are relational, but just that there is this exterior reality. And this is where, Gallagher brings up the limitations of epistemology, because we really need to know the nature of reality here in order to determine what we're perceiving, right? So we have to enter into the realm of metaphysics. And as an Aristotelian Thomist, my view is that we have a prime mover sustaining all of existence constantly. So with or without me, this phone is being sustained, and it's the sounds it makes, the colors it has, all of that, the one that's recording this video, all of that is being sustained by God, with or without me sensing it. Even if no human beings existed, then this exterior reality and not just of primary properties, but of secondary properties, this exterior reality would remain steadfast. It would, animals would still be going around, and even without animals, without any sensation at all, these exterior objects would still exist. So, in conclusion, our first principle of epistemology is that we must accept what we receive by the senses to be truth, unless we have a bodily defect, which we could know from experience or by using our other senses to determine this. And we could use maybe even other people's testimony for help in that regard. So bodily defects are the only reason why we can't trust our senses. Other than that, we have to take for granted that we trust our senses. And if that's the case, then we have to take for granted that this object contains blue, right? I might not be able to determine the true color of it, because that would imply that there's a true amount of light that it's supposed to receive, which seems absurd. It has a true color based on the light that is being shone on it right now, and so that is objective. And this view of epistemology, it goes in conjunction with the Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysical view. By appealing to metaphysics and absolute idealism, we can maintain our naive realism that what we are sensing, again, as long as there's no bodily defect, what we are sensing is true, and it's truly happening, and it's real, with or without us.